Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. This time, we're tackling something I think we've all thought about at some point. Just how safe is it to use those hands-free phones in the car? We got our hands on the wheel, right, so we're good, right? But is it really that simple?
Yeah, that's a really good question.
To help us unpack this, we're diving into a research study by Treffner and Barrett. It came out back in 2004, and it was published in the journal Transportation Research Part F.
Okay.
And, they found some pretty surprising things that I think really challenge the assumptions a lot of us have about hands-free phones being this totally risk-free way to chat and drive.
It really does challenge those common assumptions about hands-free being the sort of risk-free way to have a conversation while driving.
Before we get too far into the weeds here,
Yeah.
could you give us a little background on this study? Did they, stick people in those driving simulators, or how did they actually test this stuff?
No, this wasn't simulators. This was a real driving track, a closed-circuit driving track.
Oh.
So they had real cars, a real road, real stakes for the drivers involved.
That's much more realistic than I would have thought. So, okay, if they weren't focused on, people fumbling with their phones or anything, what were they really interested in? What aspect of hands-free phone use were they trying to get at?
They were looking at how the cognitive demands of a conversation, even when it's hands-free, can impact your driving performance.
Okay, so it's more about what's going on in our brains than whether or not we're physically holding a phone.
Yeah, exactly, because the mental effort required to have that conversation can actually take away from your ability to drive safely.
Okay, now that is fascinating.
Yeah.
But how do you even start to test something like that? What kind of conversations were they having these drivers engage in? Were they deep philosophical debates?
Well, they had a range, actually. Some were really simple, like reversing the order of two numbers they heard.
Oh, yeah.
But they also had some more challenging conversations, where they'd ask the drivers to do some mental math or categorize numbers based on specific rules.
So simulating real-life conversations. You might have some easy ones. You might have some that really make you think. But did they explain how they decided how difficult these conversations were? Because that seems pretty subjective, right?
Well, they used a pretty interesting method from cognitive psychology called information reduction. It actually measures how much information gets lost, basically, when a person has to process something and then respond to it.
Oh, I see. Okay, so the more information you lose, the more demanding that conversation is on your brain.
That's the idea.
And so I'm starting to see where this is going. If your brain is busy juggling a tricky conversation, that leaves less brain power available to deal with what's happening on the road. Did they have these drivers doing specific driving tasks while they were chatting away?
Oh, absolutely. They had a whole series of tasks they had them perform.
Oh, interesting.
To see how those conversations actually affected their driving.
Okay.
Do you want to start with what they observed about cornering?
Yeah, let's do it. I'm definitely curious to hear what they found. Lay it on me. What happened when these folks tried to take a corner while they were chatting?
Well, one of their big findings was that drivers who were busy chatting, even if it was a pretty simple conversation, they consistently braked later when they were approaching a corner.
So they were braking closer to the turn, cutting it a little close.
Yes, closer to the corner, spatially and temporally closer before they would do anything like brake or any other control action. They related this to what's known as the field of safe travel. It's a concept from Gibson and Crooks.
Field of safe travel? That sounds familiar. Isn't that sort of an invisible bubble around your car, all the space you need to maneuver safely?
That's it. It's about having that space around you to react and adjust to whatever is going on. And the study, it kind of suggests that when you're on a call, you might be misjudging the corner's affordances, so to speak.
Affordances, right. Now, there's another one of those terms. Can you just remind us, what does that mean in the context of driving?
Sure. Affordances are basically all the different actions that are possible in a given environment.
Okay.
So, for example, a wide open highway, that affords speeding up, right? Whereas a narrow winding road affords caution and lower speeds.
Okay, got it. So when you say people might misjudge the corner's affordances while on the phone, are you saying they're not accurately perceiving those possibilities for action, like braking or adjusting their speed because they're distracted?
Exactly. You're not fully paying attention, so you're not reacting as effectively to those cues.
Wow, that's actually a little scary when you think about it. It's like our brains are a step behind because of that conversation. But what about other driving situations? Did they look at braking in a more controlled setting, like, say, approaching a traffic light?
They did, and this is where things get really interesting. They found that while braking distances weren't that different between folks who were talking and those who weren't, the way they braked was a completely different story.
Okay, so it wasn't so much about how quickly they stopped, but how they actually hit the brakes. Interesting.
Right. And they found that conversations led to what they called a hard contact braking style, which basically means you're braking more abruptly, less smoothly.
Hard contact braking. That sounds kind of rough. Can you unpack that a little bit more for us? What exactly does that look and feel like?
So imagine you've got a ball, just gently rolling across a table. It naturally slows down and comes to a nice, smooth stop. Right?
Yeah.
That's how we want our braking to be smooth and controlled. But this hard contact braking, that's the opposite. It's like you're slamming on the brakes at the last minute.
Oof. Yeah, I can see how that would not be a pleasant experience for anyone in the car.
Yeah.
So it's not just about stopping in time. It's about stopping gracefully, making sure you're not jolting everyone around.
Right. And they actually had a way to measure this smoothness using something called tau dot.
Tau dot. Now that sounds like we're getting into the technical stuff.
Right.
Break that down for us non-engineers out there. What is this tau dot all about?
Well, essentially, tau dot is just a way to quantify how smoothly you're braking. So, like, a lower tau dot value would mean you're braking nice and easy.
Okay, so the lower the better.
Exactly. And a higher value would mean you're braking more abruptly, like that hard contact style we talked about.
So even if I'm thinking, hey, I'm stopping in plenty of time, just being on the phone could be making me a much jerkier braker than I realize. And that could not only be uncomfortable for everyone in my car, but could even cause problems for the drivers behind me, right?
You got it. Smooth braking is definitely safer braking for everyone on the road.
Okay, so we've covered cornering, we've covered braking. What other driving challenges did they have these folks doing while they were chatting on their hands-free phones?
They had one more test up their sleeve, and it's probably the one you'd think of first when you're thinking about the risks of distracted driving. Obstacle avoidance.
Oh, the classic swerve test. Okay, so they had to swerve around an obstacle while on a call. I bet that really showed how those conversations were affecting their driving.
It really did. And this is where things get kind of interesting because it shows how our brains try to adjust when we know we're distracted. They found that drivers who were on those calls actually drove slower on average during this test, like they were trying to be extra careful.
Yeah, I can see that. Sometimes I catch myself driving a little slower when I'm on a call. Like I'm subconsciously thinking, okay, I need to give myself a little more time to react just in case something happens. But did that slower speed actually help them do better on this obstacle avoidance test? Were they able to swerve effectively even while they were distracted?
Well, that's the thing. Even though they were driving slower, their reactions were still delayed. They didn't start swerving as quickly, and even the timing of those side-to-side forces you feel during a swerve was off.
So even though they were trying to compensate by driving slower, their brains still weren't processing the need to swerve as quickly. It's like that conversation created a kind of mental lag.
That's a great way to put it. And this brings us right back to those affordances we were talking about earlier.
Right, those possibilities for action that the environment presents.
Exactly. And this test showed that even when you try to be extra careful, when you're distracted, your ability to perceive and react to those affordances, in this case, that obstacle and the need to swerve, well, it gets compromised.
It's like you can't fully escape the effects of that distraction, even if you're trying to be more conscious. This is all so fascinating and honestly a bit eye-opening. I always considered myself a pretty decent multitasker. But this research is making me rethink that whole idea. It seems like even just a simple conversation can create these subtle but significant delays in our perception and reaction time when we're driving.
It really underscores how driving safely isn't just about mastering those physical skills of steering and braking. It's just as much about having the mental bandwidth, that attention to process everything that's going on and make good decisions in real time. And this is where those concepts of effectivities and affordances really come into play.
Okay, I think we need to dive into that a little deeper. We've talked about affordances, which are all the possibilities for action that the driving environment offers. But what about these effectivities?
Right.
What are they, and how do they fit into this whole picture? So affordances, those are like all the possibilities for action, all the things you could do on the road, right? Like, an open lane for merging or a clear path to pass.
Right.
Yeah. But what about these effectivities? How do those fit in?
Think of effectivities as like your driving superpowers.
Okay.
All the things that make you a good driver your skills behind the wheel, your perception, being able to see what's happening around you, your attention span, how quickly you react, basically all those things that let you take advantage of the affordances the road's giving you.
So it's like a two-way street, right? The road offers all these possibilities, but it's up to us, the drivers, to actually be aware enough, skilled enough to use those possibilities safely.
Yeah.
Kind of like a dance between you and the road.
That's a good way to put it.
And this study is really saying that even just a simple hands-free call can mess with those effectivities, those skills that make you a good driver.
Exactly.
So it's not just about the road itself changing, it's about our ability to deal with the road changing, right? I mean, we could be driving on the same stretch of highway we've driven 1,000 times.
Yeah.
But if we're on the phone, suddenly our brains aren't as sharp, our reactions might be a little slower.
Right.
And that same familiar road could become a lot riskier.
You got it. And this is why that whole hands-free equals risk-free idea, it just doesn't make sense. Even if your hands are on the wheel, eyes on the road, if you're having a conversation, that's still taking your focus away from driving, and that's making you less safe.
This has been so interesting and honestly a little bit scary. I'm sure we've all been there, right?
Yeah.
On a call, in the car, and you get that feeling like maybe you're not quite as on top of things as you should be.
Yeah.
And this research just proves that that feeling is real. It has a real impact on how safely we can drive.
And, this research was done back in 2004, so it makes you wonder, how much worse are things now?
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. Back then, it was basically just hands-free calling, right?
Yeah.
Now we've got this whole digital world competing for our attention while we're driving, texting, GPS, music, podcasts, heck, even video calls.
Wow.
I mean, if a simple conversation could have the effects they found in this study, think about what all these more complex interactions are doing to our brains.
It's a little scary to think about.
It is. And it's not even just about those really obvious distractions like phones. You've got all these fancy infotainment systems in cars now, people chatting in the car with you, and even just your own thoughts and worries can distract you from driving.
Yeah.
It's like we're constantly bombarded with things that are pulling our attention away from the road. And this deep dive has really been a good reminder that attention, that is the most valuable thing you have when you're driving.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it doesn't matter how experienced you are, how good your driving skills are. Without attention, anyone can make mistakes.
So true. It really comes down to recognizing that distracted driving can take a lot of different forms and doing what you can to minimize those distractions as much as possible.
Yeah.
We need to be a little more self-aware about how much we're asking of our brains while we're driving and really make that conscious effort to stay focused on the road.
Yeah. So for everyone listening, next time you get behind the wheel, remember what we've talked about today. Even those seemingly harmless hands-free calls can have a real impact on your ability to drive safely. There really is no such thing as hands-free when it comes to how much those conversations demand from your brain. Ask yourself, am I really giving driving the attention it deserves right now? And if the answer is no, well, maybe it's time to put the phone down, silence those notifications, and just focus on getting to your destination safely.
Drive safely, everyone.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it helpful. And remember, safe driving starts with a focused mind. We'll see you next time.